Well, this is certainly not a new or unique subject, but it's always worth discussion when it comes up. And I have a few thoughts on the matter. I was struck by your statement that when you were growing up, these roles of men and women were defined. Now, I'm just a tiny bit older than you are, but that's not the way I remember it. I remember growing up at a time when everything was being challenged and experimented with. I remember a time of communes and group marriage, what have you. You name it, it was on the table. It was in the news and it was being presented as a viable alternative to tradition. That's the way I remember it. Just goes to show that no two people ever see the same thing the same way, however big or small. Now, it's a funny thing with traditions. What we are cultured to think of as tradition seems very often to be, instead of a real tradition, more of an ideology-driven concept of the way things should be. We seem to remember things not as they really were, but as we would have liked them to have been. And this is nothing new in American society by any means. It was even true it was true of the Romans. Their ideal Roman was very rare in real life, but that's how they saw themselves, was by that ideal. Anyway, until just a few generations ago, this business of gender roles was really more a function of class. In the upper classes, child rearing was not a parental function. When the child grew to an age to be amenable to it, the parents would be responsible for instilling values in children. But the nurturing, the day-to-day stuff, that was the business of servants. And contrasted to that are the lower classes, where children were expected to contribute financially to their own subsistence, as were women. It was only in the small but growing middle class, in the last century really, for the most part, that you see anything approaching what has become thought of in American society as a traditional nuclear family, with traditional, and I use the word traditional advisedly, gender roles for the man and woman in the nuclear family relationship. Now, if you look back to the time when these gender roles that I think you're thinking of really became a part of the American cultural fabric, the late 40s into the 50s and 60s. In reality, there were very few families that actually fit that mold to a T, even then. It was, however, something that most married couples who formed a family were striving for and tried to project an image of being. It was the ideal, not the real. And I think an appropriate side note there would be to point out that at that time, concomitant with the adoption of this ideal was also a growing awareness of the problem of juvenile delinquency. Not that that was anything new or something that only existed at that time, but that was the time when people, or the media, or society as a whole, became concerned with it in a serious and general way. And it seems to me that this awareness and focus on juvenile delinquency at the same time was itself a form of condemnation of families that didn't meet the ideal, and was at the same time a tacit admission that the ideal was not quite the norm. Now really it was the Depression and post-Depression political economy that made the nuclear family both possible and desirable. Since jobs were few, it was socially desirable to keep half the potential workforce unemployed. And since women had been chattel within memory, and women were universally considered to be weaker than men, obviously it would be women that would stay home and men that would go out and work. The change we've seen the last generation or two is also due to political economy. In relative terms, the wages of labor have not kept pace with the costs of living. And for most people, survival depends on everyone working. At the root, I think it's as simple as that. But of course, changes in lifestyle necessarily produce changes in attitudes. Again, no one sees the same things in exactly the same way. To the people forced to change their lifestyles through no fault of their own, it has to seem that something that they valued and were comfortable with has been lost, and that this is a bad thing that must have been visited on them for reasons that just aren't immediately obvious. There was an interesting comment that was made, and I'd like to respond to that here rather than just writing a comment to the comment. Let me read it. I think that what bothers me the most is when feminists say that mothers who choose to stay at home are somehow deficient in their lives and careers, but isn't the most important, but isn't the most feminist thing a woman can do whatever she chooses for herself? That was one of the huge detriments of the movement in the 70s. As a young woman 30 years later, I think that it's a travesty. Homemaker is not a real job. Not only does a woman maintain a career, but she must also be a mommy. In short, I generally agree. Now, some feminists may have said something like that in the heat of an argument. But that is not a fair characterization of the feminist position, in my opinion. Rather, it is a statement argumentatively posited and attributed to feminists by anti-feminists and used as a straw man argument. Really, I don't think legitimate representatives of any movement are denigrating the role of mother. I do think that people who are opposed to change, which I think is a little too broad, not change, people who are very opposed to changes in gender roles or lifestyle will use that argument as if it was the argument posed by feminists in order to argue that point rather than a legitimate point. In other words, as I said, a straw man argument. I don't think anyone is seriously positing that there's something wrong with being a mother and only a mother. In closing, I'd like to say it's important to keep in mind that there are millions of so-called traditional families, along with millions of so-called non-traditional families. And everybody doesn't have to be the same as everybody else. I think it's important to understand that even if every family was identical to every other family, that would not produce a crop of idyllic, perfect children. It wouldn't. And that's something we need not to lose sight of.